All right, thank you. Okay, so speaking of Corporate Startup Lab real quickly, I know that we're kind of late in the year to be doing one of these connects, but they were gracious enough to let me do it today because I'm up here anyways for our Corporate Entrepreneurship Forum tomorrow. So if you're interested in how large companies can work with startups, or if you, even more importantly, have a startup that you're looking to get some of those magical things called customers. Tomorrow is a target-rich day for all of you. We'll have about 350 execs in person, about another 150 online. So if you're here in person, and you can be here in person tomorrow, it's down in the Simmons Auditorium on the first floor of the building. And if you can't, you can obviously join online as well. And I think that's the end of the CSL plugs, because the topic actually to talk about today is kind of a complement to the workshop that Dave Mwini did earlier in the semester with all of you. So if you remember Dave's talk, it was kind of on generally what is the lean startup, what is the lean startup methodology. And this should be a familiar visual if you watched that talk. And if you didn't watch that talk, but you've kind of been in the entrepreneurial ecosystem over the last few years, this is a pretty familiar framework. But the idea here, I'm going to see if this spotlight thing is going to work. Oh, wow. So the idea here is that you go through build, measure, and learn, and you sort of iterate through these over and over again, right? And what we're trying to do as we go through these loops, right, is we're trying to basically apply the scientific method to your startup, right? We're trying to figure out the key critical assumptions about your startup and figure out if they're true or not by building something to quickly validate or invalidate that, measuring customers' reaction to that, learning from how they react to what learning from what you've measured, and then figuring out the next thing to build. And so this is sort of, lean startup in one slide. If you were to kind of try to summarize the entire book, the entire methodology into one slide. And I really like it, but there is a problem with this visual, which is it implies, at least I think when you look at this slide, it implies that you spend about a third of your time building, about a third of your time measuring, and about a third of your time learning. But if you actually think about the startups that you're working on right now, my intuition is that that's not actually what your calendar would reflect, right? Your calendar doesn't actually reflect a third of your time going to measuring, a third of your time going to actually learning from what you're measuring. That might be like a good split of like the value being created. But in most startups, especially most high growth startups, the reality is that, probably on the order of 80 to 85% of the energy that you spend on your startup goes towards that building activity, right? Whatever that next thing that you're going to build is. And so that's really what we want to focus in on today. And my hope is at the end of our conversation today that we'll have double clicked on that build box a little bit and be able to answer two key questions, right? The first is, well, how should I think about what to build? And the second is, okay, once I know what to build, what's the right way to try to understand, manage, and monitor the time I'm spending building that to make sure that I can actually predict how long it's going to take me to get through these build, measure, learn cycles, right? Because as entrepreneurs, we tend to think about build, measure, learn as the cycles we're going through. But the reality is when you think about that, maybe that significant other that you're trying to convince to let you work on this startup some more and for them to continue to support you, or maybe your mom and dad who you're trying to convince that they didn't waste money sending you to Carnegie Mellon, right? Like they don't tend to think about build, measure, learn cycles. They tend to think about calendar time. The punchline, by the way, on mom and dad is when mom stops believing in the startup, like you really, that's a good existential moment to think about it in general. But the point is, like, calendar, it tends to be measured in calendar time, not in build, measure, learn cycles. And so if 80% of the time goes towards that building step, we need to get really good at predicting how long it's going to take us to build that next thing. So again, the two questions we're trying to answer are, first and foremost, What are we going to build? And then second, okay, how do we add some predictability to the time that we're spending on that? Okay, so we're going to spend more than just this one slide on this, but at a high level, this again should be one of the other kind of quick review slides from Dave's talk earlier in the semester. When we talk about what to build, the answer, if you recall, is what's often called in Lean Startup methodology an MVP, for minimally viable product, or what I like to call MAP, right? Because viable often alludes to crappy. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But either way, straight from Eric's book, this is the definition of what an MVP is. He makes the argument that an MVP is the version of a product and the or services from me, because I think we'll talk about some misconceptions in a minute, but it's not always a product. The version of a new product or service, which allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning about customers with as little effort as possible. So we'll spend more time on this, but at the high level, if you remember kind of one thing from this question of what do you build, right? What you want to be asking yourself is, how can I learn as much as I can about my customers with as little work as possible? And that is basically the essence of the answer to this question of what are you trying to build? And again, typically refer to this as an MVP. Now, MVPs and this topic has become really popular. Like people use it, probably misuse it more than they use it correctly at this point. So before we kind of continue down this path, I want to just kind of highlight 5, in my mind, very common misunderstandings around this topic of MVPs, right? So the first of these is that viable does not equal crappy. And the easiest way maybe to explain this one is to tell a story that some of you may have heard before, but I think it does illustrate the point really well. And it does it in a way where I'm not making fun of any entrepreneur who you could possibly know, which I always try to avoid in these kind of talks. You want to point out the mistakes, but you don't really want to highlight people who are in the middle of experiencing those mistakes. So this was now almost 10 years ago. I went to Lisbon, Portugal as part of a trip where the Kauffman Foundation sent a number of people from the US over to Europe to spend a week in Europe. And I had a friend who was a Fulbright scholar when I was here earlier who was back in Lisbon. So I was always happy to go on that trip as long as Lisbon was one of the cities that they sent me to. So it'd be all over Europe over a couple of weeks. I did it for a number of years. But one year when I went over there, I ended up in Lisbon, and you sort of generally on these trips, you do two things. You do, sort of rubber chicken style talks like this, where you get up in front of large groups and you try to say something that's semi-entertaining, and that is what it is. But the other thing, which is actually kind of often the more fun part of it, is you do these one-on-one meetings, like office hour style meetings with entrepreneurs. So I sat down with 2 entrepreneurs from Lisbon who both had just gotten married, and their now wives were, in each other's wedding party. So they'd sort of like lived 2 parallel weddings, like the one that they were part of and their wives' best friend's wedding as well. And through that, they had become friends as well. And so they'd kind of gone through this experience. And I'm telling you, I guess on the front end here, these guys were like lean startup fanboys. Like these guys brought the Eric Ries book with them. They had like highlighted it. They had Post-it notes sticking out of the side of it. I think they slept with the book underneath their pillow so that, like, by osmosis, they could learn. That's a joke. Not a good joke, but it is. That was an attempt at a joke. But these guys were really into it. And so we sat down and they said, look, we're here to tell you about our startup because marriage is broken. And I was like, wow, that's a bold start to an office hour. And generally, one of the things about office hours that are great is, like, in 30 minutes, it's really hard for a meeting to go terribly bad, right? But that one, like a minute, and I'm like, I do not know what I'm going to do for the next 29 minutes. I was like, well, let me just stop you before this gets like I'm a big fan of marriage. Like, My wife is like, marrying me was like truly like one of the best things that ever happened. Like, so, you know, we can keep going, but I just don't want, and just, oh, no, we're very pro marriage. We're very anti getting married. Like the process of getting married is really broken. It's like, oh, that's interesting. And so sort of for backstory on this, Dave Mawini and I were selling the first startup that we did together while I was getting married, going through the process of getting married. So we sold that business to Morgan Stanley November 30th of 2006, and December 8th of 2006, I got married. So I genuinely had no grasp on like what happened to make our wedding come together. But my wife is amazing, and so she put up with that, which is awesome. So I was like, okay, this is interesting. Like, tell me more about how getting married is broken. This is fascinating. And they were like, well, so here's the problem. And they told me the story. They said, you know, often you would come home after a really long day, and your fiance would say, we have this really important decision to make tonight. We have to decide, do we want to put beige or off-white tissue paper in the wedding invitations? And they said the problem with that question is that those are the same colors. But if you say, I don't care, that becomes a whole fight. And so we're gonna create software to fix the process of getting married. Now, this may be a good idea or a bad idea. Like, it doesn't really matter. Again, what I'm trying to do here is illustrate a point without telling you a story about an entrepreneur who you all know, because I think anybody who's willing to take the risk to be an entrepreneur, like, you don't want to be anything but publicly supportive of them. But it is also helpful to learn from others' missteps. So I try to tell a lot of my missteps, and I try to highlight entrepreneurs that I know you'll never meet. So on this one, I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. Maybe it's a good idea, maybe not. Again, I didn't know much about wedding planning, so I didn't really have a strong point of view on this. I was like, okay, well, and these guys, again, Eric Reed's fanboys, right? I said, okay, well, what was your MVP? And they said, oh, we built a landing page. And this is a very common MVP. The concept behind a landing page is you build a single website, single web page, I'm sorry, 2 versions of it. You use paid advertising to drive traffic to those 2 different pages, the same amount of traffic to the 2 different pages. And you look at which page converts better. So you can say like, oh, you know, the first one has these set of features, the second one has those set of features. If one of them gets a 3% response rate and one gets a 0.2% response rate, you know which features are more likely to get people to sign up. That tells you a lot of learning about your customers with a little bit of effort. So it's a very reasonable approach. Transparently, here at Carnegie Mellon, I think it's probably an overused approach. Like, I think our entrepreneurs here in general, myself included, we tend to love data. And so it's like a really easy way to get a lot of data. And so I think we may overuse it here, which I'll get to in a little bit. But the point is, it's a very reasonable approach, and there was no reason why that wouldn't be the right thing. So, okay, tell me more about it. And she talked about the 2 feature sets. It's like, okay, that's interesting. Well, which features drove a higher conversion? And as we started talking through it, they said, well, nobody signed up for the service. And I was like, that is very surprising. Like, that is incredibly surprising. You don't seem to understand how surprising it is, but let me explain it this way. If we could get the ads through Facebook, which maybe right now with how much trouble they're in, we could, but in general, if we could get the ads through Facebook without their quality control stopping it, right, I could build a landing page right now that says, I'm a Somalian prince, please give me your social security number. And if I could send enough traffic to that landing page, somebody would fill it out. There's this magical thing on the internet, which is like some percentage of internet users happily fill out forms for just about anything, right? So the fact that they had a 0% conversion rate after tens and tens of thousands of people going to the site was super problematic. So I made the assumption that I think any of you would make, which is they probably forgot to test the submit button. And so I was like, oh, well, let's pull up the site. We'll take a look at it. I think, you know, it'd be a little awkward, but we'll hit submit. They'll realize that the thing didn't work. And well, when they pulled up the page, I didn't actually need them to test the submit button at all, because they called it a landing page, but a more accurate description would be landing pages, plural. It was multiple pages long, just paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of text, white background, black Times New Roman font. And if you were a complete glutton for punishment and you had read through all of that text, at the bottom, if you remember kind of circa 1998 web pages with just a gray submit button at the bottom, that was how you opted in for their tool. And this is where you just got to love entrepreneurs. You can't make this. So I remember saying to them, do you remember talking about the beige versus off-white tissue paper? And the guy literally starts trying to scroll to where he has a thing about how they'll help you pick colors for your wedding. And I was like, no. Would your now wife want software that looks like this associated with her wedding? And the answer was obviously no, right? And what I realized at that moment is he had made this mistake. He had thought minimally viable was actually minimally crappy product, right? He built something that was really minimal, but it was so crappy. All he ended up validating or invalidating was that people don't like crappy software. And it actually turns out you don't need to do that test. There's no need to run a test to say, like, will people like crappy software? The answer to that question is no, they won't. Like, let me save you. You don't even need to build, there's no build, measure, learn on that, right? But what you actually want to do, the real essence of what we're trying to do here is you're trying to do something really minimal, but do it in an awesome way, right? You're trying to do the little things that you're trying to test still with excellence so that you can validate or invalidate those critical things. And so again, viable doesn't equal crappy. It actually leads to the second point though, which is now MVP is actually an acronym that makes sense. You see, MVP is a fun acronym. And if you went to Dave's workshop, you saw all the references to the athletes who've been MVPs, and that's super fun. But it turns out it has nothing to do with what we're trying to do here. What you're actually trying to do when you build an MVP is you're trying to map out where you're heading, right? It's not a destination at all. And this relates to sort of my number one pet peeve when I was spending a lot of time investing in early stage startups, which is entrepreneurs would come into my office and they'd say, I need $250,000 or I need $500,000 to build an MVP. That's like a misuse of the term. You don't need $250,000 or $500,000 to build an MVP. What you need is $250,000 or $500,000 to go through a number of those build, measure, learn cycles to create more value so that you can map out where you're heading, then raise more money to keep going that way, right? So it's not a destination, right? It's a map on where you're heading. And so you can use charts like this to kind of help you keep track of it. So you can end up showing each MAP that you're building across the top. And then you can answer questions like, well, how's the customer going to interact with it? What am I hoping to learn? How much is the cost? And then you can see as you step through each of these, learning and unlearning things, right? You can end up moving through the process. I see a couple people trying to take a picture on this. Allison will post the slide. Yeah, so the slides will be available later if you want those as well. Just you're welcome to take pictures too, but just so that you know. So this is kind of a helpful way to think about it, right? Think about it as this map where you're heading and you're kind of taking these steps through. Okay, the next thing is that it validates or invalidates really key hypotheses about your business. That is not, that almost never say never because there are exceptions to this, but in general, most of the time, that's not, can I build what I have in mind? Rarely is, oh, is this something I can build? The riskiest thing about your business, right? It's usually more, will anybody care if I built it? And again, some of this builds on the talk that Dave gave early in the semester on the lean startup. So if you didn't get a chance to attend that workshop, I'd encourage you to go back and watch the video of that. But you're trying to make sure that when you have these MAPs, you can clearly articulate this question right here. What am I hoping to learn? Right, so you can see 3 different potential answers there. But what am I hoping to learn as I move through each of these different MAPs, right? Each of these different ones. So the idea is I'd sort of fill this out That would be what I build first. I'd measure and learn, and then I decide, okay, what do I build next? And I'd fill these out. But each time I know how the customer is going to interact with it, what I'm hoping to learn, and I make sure it's not crappy, and it really validates that next most important hypothesis. The next one, and this is something where I think our colleagues over at HCII have a lot to teach the rest of us about this. It does not have to be a product at all, right? Often we think about these things as like, oh, I gotta build, gotta sling a bunch of code to do these things because that's important. So sometimes it's literally like sitting down with somebody and putting a paper prototype in front of them, right? It's not technically a product at all. Or sometimes it's you know, doing manually what you're later going to have really smart adaptive systems do. That often works out really well. And then this last one is really just for my friends here at Carnegie Mellon, because I think in general, we don't over-index on this, but it just, when I think about the entrepreneurs I meet with, we do tend to over-index on landing pages here. And I think it's, again, because it's like, it feels really comfortable. You know, you send 50,000 people to a landing page, there's a lot of data that you can torture to tell you a lot of stuff about that. Unclear how much of that is really validated learning. So again, landing pages are a good technique, but they're not the only good technique. Okay, so coming back now to this first of two questions with that as background, right? So if we're going to talk about what do we want to build and then how do we want to build it, right? We want to go through and talk about a few examples here. So the first of these is a storyboard, right? The idea behind a storyboard is similar to what you think about when you think about a storyboard for like a movie or a TV commercial, except for that great storyboards for entrepreneurs talk about what the customer does before they use the product, how they use the product, and then after they're done using it, right? So this is not just the narrative of, you know, how you would promote your product, but this is what is the customer doing before, during, and after. So let's imagine that somebody out there has an idea for what we'll call tartangram. This is a terrible idea, so do not use this idea. But I'm just trying to, again, I don't like to tell real entrepreneur stories, so sometimes just make up bad pitches, right? So tartangram is this really terrible startup idea where I'm going to take pictures and I'm going to superimpose CMU colors on the images, and then I'm going to share it with my friends. So it's like a worse version of Instagram. It's a really bad idea. But because it's a really bad idea, now you can think about the storyboard with me. So the storyboard would not simply be you promoting how you take pictures and add CMU colors to it, right? The storyboard idea would be, what are you doing right before you use it? Oh, so right before you use it, you're looking at it and say, oh, it's snowing. I should take a picture of this and share it with my friends who live in places where it doesn't snow in November. And so then I take out my phone, I take a picture. That's the during, right? So the before is, oh, I should take a picture. The during is I take the picture, I add the CMU colors to it, I share it. And then after would be like, and then people send me notes back about how cool it is that I added the CMU colors to my picture. Yes, nobody's really going to do that. But again, we're just trying to show you before, during, and after, right? And so you can step through that. And then when you have one of those, you can go put those in front of customers. And it becomes really helpful because you can then put that in front of a customer and get their reaction to it. And so you're holding it up in front of them and you're saying like, okay, here's what I have in mind. What do you think about it? Right? I think there's really three benefits to this. One is it kind of almost functions like a mirror with your prospective customers. Right? So you're showing them something, they're reacting to it. That encourages them to be a bit more honest. Typically, before you do these, I encourage people to do kind of structured interviews with potential customers, kind of before you do any of these other MVPs we're talking about. But one of the risks on structured interviews is people will think they're being really nice to you, when in fact, what they're actually doing is just telling you what they think you want, what they think you want to hear. And that's just kind of wired into it. I think how we raise people in America, most Americans think that's nice. Most Americans also were taught the story of Johnny Appleseed, and so they were also taught not to lie to people, right? And so when you hold a mirror up in front of somebody, he says, does this look like a reflection of you? People will feel inclined to be honest with you. Whereas if you say like, tell me about my idea, they'll be inclined to say, oh, it's a good idea, find something positive to say. And then also, obviously, this last one, you are unlikely to fall in love with it. I've met with lots of entrepreneurs over the last 10 years who fell in love with their startup. I've not met with an entrepreneur yet who fell in love with their storyboard, right? So it's a great way to kind of keep you honest on the front end here. I'll do this really quickly because it's, I want to leave a little bit of time here, but this was a great story, and you can follow the link if you want to kind of watch all of this online. This was a great story from South by Southwest like 8 years ago. This was back when every company was trying to have an app strategy. So today it might be like every company is trying to have an AI strategy. 10 years ago, everybody wanted to have an app strategy. Like, what are we going to do with these iPhones? iPhones are fun to use. We should use iPhones. And so the board at TurboTax challenged the TurboTax team, like, hey, let's make sure we have an app strategy for doing your taxes. And if you think about that idea, that's a terrible idea. That might be a worse idea than the tartangram idea that I said, right? Because if doing taxes on this is terrible, doing my taxes on this would be even worse, right? Like, just think about the screen real estate. But the team actually thought, like, well, before we just go build this terrible thing to make the board happy, we should go see if anybody will use it. And so when they sat down and kind of walked through their storyboard, people came back to them and said, look, and you can see like the story here is like husband and wife doing the dishes, like, oh, we should do our taxes. Oh, well, let's go to the app store and download the TurboTax app and enter a bunch of information on our cell phone and take some pictures of our receipts. And then when we're done with it, we can, email the taxes to our laptops so that we can print it out, right? And so people, not surprisingly, were like, well, that's definitely not a benefit I want, and that's definitely not the problem I'm looking to solve. But remember that point when you talked about taking pictures of your receipts? That's really valuable. So they sort of reframed the problem, not as, do I use my laptop or do I use my cell phone? But they reframed it as, what if these two together were better than either one by themselves? And if you think about, lots of homes at this point would not have had a scanner. This is kind of before Expensify, lots of apps were doing scanning of receipts. And so it became this valuable thing. I will tell you one really interesting anecdote from this, and then we'll keep moving. This is kind of a fascinating thing that, talking to the TurboTax guys, again, about 8 years ago at South by about this, I didn't really think about it, but tax software, you basically get like one shot a year to get it right, roughly, right? Because most people do their taxes between like February and March or April, or if they get an extension maybe in the summer. But like, if you don't get it right, it's not like you can like redo taxes in the fall. Like, oh, I'll just come up with a new, better version of my tax software in the fall, right? So you basically have a year. So using tools like this are actually extremely important when you're doing build, measure, learn towards the end of like literally just like one release cycle, right? And so it ended up working really well for them. Okay, so that was the first one. That's storyboards. Second one is landing pages. We've talked about this a little bit before, but here are the things that should be true about your landing page, right? This is how you avoid building a minimally crappy landing page, right? It should be articulated from the perspective of your customer, your potential customer, not from your perspective as the owner. It should be focused on one conversion activity, should be shareable, measurable, and consistent. If you're not really good at design, the answer is not for you just to go ahead and just type a bunch of text in. The answer is for you to hire somebody in these or use a template to make the design not suck, right? There's plenty of both those options out there. If you're going to spend thousands of dollars on paid ads to drive people to a page, spend the $50 to get the page designed well. It's just kind of penny conscious, pound foolish. The next one, I won't actually play the whole video, but this is kind of the canonical example of the demo video. There are often features where people have bad mental models for what you have in mind. So before Dropbox, there were a lot of services that let you put large files on the internet. Yahoo had a really, remember Yahoo? Yahoo had a really popular service that did this. And so when Drew would go and talk to people about Dropbox, they would quickly come back with, oh yeah, I'm familiar with that. That's kind of like Yahoo File Share, but it was really nothing like Yahoo File Share. So he used a piece of software called Camtasia to basically cut a version of Dropbox that made it look like Dropbox worked before he built it. And the key thing is, remember, for each MAP, you want to make sure you can answer two questions. How's the customer going to interact with it? And what are you hoping to learn? And I will say demo videos are ones where like people really miss this a lot. So the customer what do you think the customer interaction was for this video? I'll give you a hint. It's not playing the video. It's on the screen right now. Yeah. Close. It's on the screen right now, and it's not the website URL. Nope, it's sending an email here. And the customer interaction is the email back and forth afterwards, right? So people mess this up with demo videos a lot. They're like, oh, I created this demo video and I got 10,000 people to watch it. Well, do you know what they thought about it? No. Do you know who they are? Nope. Do you know if they like the idea or not? Nope. Okay, well, you didn't learn anything then. I mean, I'm glad you're able to create a video, but like, I doubt the riskiest thing about your business is can you create a video or not? But, and Drew did a lot. Sorry, Allison, I will stay by the mic. I just can't help myself. Okay, Drew did a lot of things to make this video go viral. And if you ever watch it, like you'll see there's a bunch of sort of tech humor throughout it. But the key was this. It was getting people to send him an email here. He got 5,000 people to send him an email to sign up to be on the beta list. And then all those 5,000 people, he could email back and forth about, well, hey, I want to make sure I add you to the software when it's ready for you. What are the features that you want to take advantage of? Or, well, how are you planning to use it? How would you use it, right? And so you're learning all this stuff on that interaction back and forth. There was a local team of entrepreneurs here. I think there's a poster is around here somewhere, but the 4Moms guys, early in the days of 4Moms, which built the products for babies, they used to do, so they used to have this real question, which is like, well, how do you pick the right colors to add to, the next version of our baby product, right? So they have like a stroller, and it's like, well, what accent colors do we add to the stroller next? And what the two founders used to do is they would do contests where they would give away a stroller, and they would tell people that, like, you get a chance to win one of the new strollers for these new colors we're prototyping right now. Tell us which color you want to win if you're the winner, right? And it was a great way to see which color people actually really won, right? So the interaction there was them voting, and it helped them figure out which color to do. Now, as a tech entrepreneur, I'd be like, well, how important really is getting the right color for your stroller? Well, it turns out when your product is made with atoms instead of with bits, like ordering 10,000 of the wrong color strollers is like a really big problem. So that's a great example of how you can learn a lot about customers, how you can build and learn a lot about customers without a lot of effort. Okay, this is really popular for AI startups. So we're seeing more and more of this in general. If you think about broadly, most AI systems, I have a lot of issues with their work, but if you use the stuff coming out of prediction machines from University of Toronto, right? You can think about any AI system as basically a system that takes some data, makes a prediction, and gives that back to the user. So I think it's an oversimplification in a lot of ways, but that is broadly the book Prediction Machines in one sentence. But if you sort of use that handle and say like that's 80% correct, that means that you can sort of think about that prediction as what your software is doing. But instead of having the software do the prediction, you can have humans do the prediction, right? And so you can have someone go to a form, fill out a form, have it email you and your team, and you and your team can give them an answer back. And you can say, like, you can be really transparent about what's going on, right? That'd be sort of more like a tech-enabled service. Or you can be a little bit less transparent about it. You can say like our smart system, and it's a mix of technology and unique intellectual property, which might be your team. But you can sort of begin to sort of automate that. And then you can learn a bunch of things like, well, how would people use technology that could do predictions like that? Well, what inputs would they be comfortable giving me? What inputs would they not be comfortable giving me, right? So so we often call this kind of Wizard of Oz or manual prototype as a reference back to the movie Wizard of Oz, the person behind the curtain there, right? But it's a very popular type of MAP. Okay, so I want to move on to the how you build, but let's just I'll quickly come back because I want to just make sure we're clear. So I went through, before we finish up this what you build, I went through 4 examples that were meant to be examples. And I even called out like 4 moms as a kind of 5th wild card there. The 2 things I want to make sure you don't think. 1, I don't want you to think you must do all 4 of these or you must do them in this order. 2, I don't want you to think these are the only 4. These are just supposed to be examples to get you started thinking about, okay, what's the kind of thing that you could build if you're thinking about going down this path, right? So with that, I want to kind of turn our attention now in the time we have left to the second question, which is, okay, so if the first part of this is sort of what do you build, right? Because you want to make sure if it's 80% of your time, you're picking the right things to build next. The other part of it is, remember, when you go through these build, measure, learn cycles, right? You need to be able to translate that not into how much progress can I make across these build, measure, learn cycles, but instead translate it into how much calendar time will I have before I hit that next milestone? And so to do that, I think you need to take it sort of some of the things from Agile development. And what we're going to talk about specifically here is how you sort of operationalize some of these Agile things in the early lean entrepreneurship phase of your product's development, right? So when we use the term Agile, we mean that we're valuing, we mean basically all of this text here. And by the way, this is like what's on the screen right now. This literally is the Agile manifesto. So this term like, oh, Agile that everybody started using, like that came up because a bunch of guys went to a ski lodge and spent a weekend talking about software projects that work well. What are true about them relative to software projects that don't go well? And you know, in 2022, that seems relatively boring. In 2001, I'll tell you, like, this ended up becoming really helpful for people because then we could think about, okay, how do you build development methodologies that reflect these priorities? And so a lot of things then come over the next 20 years in terms of how we build software based on these 4 principles. But the basic high level bit here is the text in blue, you're valuing more than the text in white. So you're not saying, I don't value processes and tools. You're saying individuals and their interactions are more important. You're not saying I don't value documentation. You're saying working products are more important than documentation, right? And so then coming out of this, then the question becomes, okay, well, what's the wrapper you put around an Agile approach to building things to do this? And the reason you sort of want to take this approach as it relates to those early MAPs is threefold. 1, you're almost certainly going to be incorrect on parses. And so you're going to need to continue to iterate. So all of these things that you value are going to be really important. 2, you actually want to measure and monitor how quickly you can get through each of those interactions or iterations, I'm sorry, so that you can tell your spouse, you can tell your mom and dad, you can tell them, I need 6 more months, not I need 3 more build, measure, learn cycles. And ultimately that also allows you to predict delivery times. Okay, so if the engineering practice is Agile, and there's lots of different Agile engineering practices, one of the things that we found is that Scrum, and frankly, even more like a light version of Scrum, becomes a really helpful wrapper to wrap around that to get the visibility in. So in order to be able to do this last thing here, to be able to predict those delivery times, you need some kind of wrapper around your Agile process, right? And so that's where I think Scrum becomes particularly helpful. I've used this at a lot of my startups. Lots of other tech companies use this. There is no perfect way to do it. It will not necessarily make it easy, but it will make it easier. It's my general kind of theme of all the text up on the slide here. I'm not going to play this video now because, again, we are kind of blitz through this content, but if you want to watch that later, this is a really helpful 10-minute summary of Scrum if you're not familiar with it. My sense at this point is most people at a place like Carnegie Mellon know it, but I want to talk quickly about how we ended up in this kind of point of Scrum light, if you will. So the overall process, right, is that you have a backlog of things that you're pulling from. You pull them into what's called a sprint, or a set of work that you're going to do for a defined period of time. You blow out your ideas there, and then you go through some number of days. In traditional Scrum, it's about 30 days. We've actually seen shorter work well in startups, and every day you answer these questions. Okay, now how do we tweak that for startup work? So one, everybody should be able to add things to the backlog, right? So no matter who it is, customers, board members, overhead, I mean investors, right? They should all be able to add things to the backlog. But one person should be responsible for setting those priorities, and one person should actually be responsible for the data entry. You know, in lots of large companies, they use packaged software to do this. I would say in almost all the startups I'm part of, like Google Sheets works really, really well. It turns out a spreadsheet is a really good way to store this information, and a Google Sheet is a really great way to have one true version of a given spreadsheet. You want to pull things out, and you want to apply a consistent number of days per sprint. It does not need to be 30, but it should be the same every time, because there is some amount of lift sprint to sprint, and you want to keep that relatively consistent. If you know, the one thing I think that makes Scrum kind of magical is this, right? Whenever people do work, they don't just reduce their estimate by the number of hours they work. Instead, at the end of that work, they say, okay, based on where I am right now, how much work do I expect to remain? So if you have a given task and you say, okay, I think this is going to take me 8 hours, and then you spend 6 hours working on it, but you're like, you know what, this was a lot hairier than I expected. You don't just say, oh, I'm sure there's only 2 hours left. You might say, oh, I think there's 6 hours remaining. So you went from 8 to 6, not 8 to 2, right? You're always forward looking on your estimates. And so if you keep your estimates always forward looking, then you can end up over time looking at the average decrease in time spent each day per person or per group of people if you're working on it in a group. And that becomes what's called your velocity. The reality is that, like in most startups, the engineering teams working on this are going to be optimistic, really optimistic, but they're going to be actually, what you'll find as you start tracking velocity, they're going to be incredibly consistent in how overly optimistic they are. So they'll say like, oh, I think this will take me 8 hours. And you'll in your head go to translate that like, well, you actually get about 4 hours of your estimates a day done. So that's really like 2 days of work, right? Because you can do the translation then to what's like the relevant burn down. I find that works much better than trying to get them to be less optimistic, which has one set of problems, or use estimates that aren't time-based. So a lot of people use things like story points, things like that. You still end up having to translate that back into time over time. And so that's where I find this works really well. And then you can end up with these really helpful charts to show you what's going on. And you can identify like, you know, if you look at these two, you can see like this time, okay, starting to sketch out, I'm not going to get it done in time. This one, okay, like you still have that sort of start to, but you quickly catch up and you end up back to the mean rate. So you can kind of have this one visual that allows everybody in the company to see kind of what's going on. You get a good sense on how much content you can get through in a given sprint. And this now comes back to where we started, which is this is going to allow you to, at the end of that sprint, be able to say, okay, how many more sprints do I have before I hit that next milestone? Which again gets back to this question that we started at the beginning with, which is, well, how many more months can I work on this startup idea before I need to raise more money, before I need to get a real job, before I need to whatever, right? You can estimate, you can translate those build, measure, learn cycles now into calendar time. It's also very helpful at the end of each of these sprints to just ask yourself, what can I do better? It does force teams to do better around continuous improvement. Okay, so with that, I think we have about 10 minutes. If there's any questions, or you guys can move on. If we can talk about this or anything else for the last 10 minutes. And I know some of you need to run, which is fine. Yeah.
Question about, you're saying people normally overestimate themselves. Is there another way around where they say, oh, it'll take me 10 hours, even though it'll take you 2? Do people do that?
Not in my experience. I think most people who choose to work on early stage startups are fairly optimistic people, and they tend to push themselves harder than you as a manager will be able to push them. What you need to do though is make sure that you can kind of translate that into what's the real situation. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I had another.
Yeah, we'll come to you next. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I guess at the start you were comparing like lean entrepreneurship to agile. And I had one professor in my product class say that they're 2 separate things. You can't combine them. They're not like, you either do one or the other. There's no like in between. I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yes.
Like you're kind of saying they work together.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, I do think they work together. All right. So the really quick way that I would answer that, and again, I don't know who the professor is, I'd rather not know, but generally the way I think about this is, for any given problem you're trying to solve, you should be able to answer 2 questions about it. How well do I understand the problem, and how well do I understand the solution, right? And so I think lean as a methodology is really great when Agile is really great when you don't understand the solution part of what you're trying to build. So that can certainly be lean entrepreneurship kind of situations. That can also be just really gnarly problems where you know what the problem is, but you don't know the right solution, right? In entrepreneurship, you typically don't really know the problem when you start. You don't really know the solution, right? So if you don't know the solution, lean or agile becomes really effective. Then let's go on the other side of that spectrum. Do you really understand the problem or not, right? If you really don't understand the problem, then you need to take an iterative approach to figuring out the problem, right? And so that's where things like the customer development methodology become really helpful. In situations where you don't know the problem and you don't know the solution, to me, that in the essence is the sort of lean startup box. But you can fill in, if you think about that as a 2x2, you could fill in each of those 4 boxes, right? So if you know the problem, but you don't know the solution, Agile can be really effective, but you don't need to layer in that customer development stuff. If you if you don't know the solution, but you're pretty confident on how to kind of solve it, which is a little bit of a mind meld. But if you think about things like the Toyota production system, what you're really saying there is like, I don't know what car is going to come down the assembly line next at me, but no matter which car it is, I know the right things to grab and put in. I know the right solution. I just don't know the problem I'm going to face yet, right? So Kanban, Toyota production, like that to me it would be a really good example of, you don't know the problem, but you have a pretty strong anchoring on what the solution is, right? So that would be kind of that box. And then the only box I think we haven't done at this point is if you know the problem and you know the solution. And I would actually say if you know the problem and you know the solution, and I think like lightning strikes if you say this too much at CMU, but that really is actually where waterfall works really well. Like it's fun to rip on it, but like if you think about sort of like speccing something, building what you spec'd, making sure that what you built matches the spec, like that's super efficient if that's the world you live in, right? And so waterfall actually works really well for that box. Now, probably nobody in this room should be working on problems where we know the problem and we know the solution, right? So that's more of a life kind of strategy question. Like it's probably not a great life strategy to spend your time on known problems and known solutions. But if you're trying to do those things fast, waterfall works really, really well. So you can kind of think about it. So to me, that's kind of how I would segment those 4 buckets.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So like I think the customers operator program, And then what I found, because we are just talking about problems right now, and and the solution at the same time usually. And what we found right now is that both problem and solutions are pretty fluid and they change over time, although it's 2 weeks. Through like interviews and then talking to customers and working out potentially like it pivots a lot. So like I'm curious, during that process, how can we just have an anchor in there and kind of just working and focus on one kind of problem space or solution space?
Yeah. So I don't know the program. I'm not sure which program exactly you're talking about, but in general, when I work with entrepreneurs to do customer discovery, I try to remind them of the following. Customers are really, really good at telling you about the problems they have. They're really, really bad at reacting to the solutions you're putting in front of them, right? So what you want to do is you want to get really good in your customer discovery of understanding truly the problems that your customers have. Now, you'll find for a bunch of social reasons that we don't have time to get into today, that it's tempting to sort of finish the conversation at problem discovery. But in fact, you really do need to talk a little bit about solution just to kind of make that conversation feel a little bit more normal. But people are, but what you're really anchoring on there is like, what's the problem or problems that my customers have around this area? And so generally when I'm doing structured interviews or when I'm working with entrepreneurs to do it, I think about it as make sure they really are my target customer, right? So keep in mind, if they're not your target customer, that's noise, not signal, right? And I see a lot of entrepreneurs, especially in programs where the number of interviews you're doing is kind of a vanity metric. So Steve Blank and I go back and forth on this a lot. Like, I think sometimes you can make, oh, I did 50 interviews. And that's more of a vanity metric, I would argue, than like a helpful learning thing, right? But what gets really dangerous is if 30 of those interviews are not great customers for you, like you got a big problem at that point, right? Because now you're talking about people who aren't that predictive of actually concept. So are they your target customer? Do they have the problem that you have in mind? And how do they currently solve it? Because if it's a real problem for them, they will be doing something to duct tape, paper clip together a solution to that. So let me kind of explain this with an example that I often use because it tends to really help people get this quickly. So if you think about this device, people will often say like, oh, I didn't know I wanted an iPhone till I saw the iPhone. But if you actually used a BlackBerry a lot before the iPhone, you absolutely knew the problem that the iPhone was solving. What you didn't probably know, and in fact, and I was like addicted to my BlackBerry, I would have told you for sure a single pane of glass is not the solution to making the iPhone better, right? But what I could have told you for sure is like one of the big problems around my iPhone or on my BlackBerry was that it was terrible at consuming non-textual content, right? So BlackBerry messaging, text-based emails, BlackBerry was amazing. If the email had a link in it, I basically couldn't deal with it on the subway on my BlackBerry. I'd have to wait till I got to my office to deal with it. All right, so I could have told you the problem. I could have told you how I solved the problem, which is wait till I can use my laptop to consume that content. I could not have told you the solution to that problem, right? I didn't know the solution to that problem. I knew that that's what entrepreneurs know. And so when you think about it, entrepreneurs doing customer discovery get obsessive about talking to people who really are their target customers, not just other people who they can get interviews with so they can say to their team like, oh, I did 50 interviews, but real target customers understand the problem, how they're currently solving it. Then you as the entrepreneur come in and say, okay, and based on enabling technology, based on my vision of the future of the world, this is how I'm going to solve those problems 10 times better than how they're currently being solved, right? And so to me, like, that's the activity. I personally, I mean, whatever program you should follow their directions, but I personally would not try to validate my solution via interviews with a customer. I think that's a poor approach. I try to validate that the people I'm talking to really are my target customers. They really have the problem I have in mind. And the way they're currently solving it, I can do much better. My solution, I believe, would be much better than how they're currently solving that problem. Yeah.
So sometimes at the end of the interview, when you ask them, like, for example, would you use products that's similar to iPhone? Would that solve the problem in this proposal?
No, because so there's two problems with, I mean, so that's a bad question on a, like, I would not, the quick thing is do not, like, in my opinion, people who recommend that, like, I would not ask that question would be my quick summary. There's a bunch of reasons why I wouldn't ask that question. One, some of it gets back to this nice question. Most people will tell you yes, even if they won't. Two, people are terrible at predicting their behavior. So even if they don't have this flaw of trying to be nice, people are absolutely awful at predicting their future behavior. Think back to January 1st of this year. What behavior were you pretty sure you're going to be doing this year? Or you're going to eat healthy, go to the gym 3 times a week, definitely never. I mean, I know nobody drinks at Carnegie Mellon, but you're definitely not going to drink this year. Drink your body weight in ounces in water every day, right? We're just awful at predicting what we're going to do. So one, people lie. Two, even if they're not lying to you, they're bad at predicting their future behavior. It's not an effective thing. That's honestly, that's where all of these techniques and things like this are really helpful. If you think about what I'm doing here, especially with these three, this one is kind of almost your bridge from you kind of interview to storyboard to these. Not that there's always a script. But if you think what you're doing, especially in these three, you're pivoting this conversation from like, what are they saying they're going to do to what are they actually going to do? Right? Because if I say I've got a smart adaptive system that can take a bunch of unstructured data and give you this really valuable piece of information back, I'm not asking you, would you use a system like that? I'm saying I have a system like that. Give me the data and I'll react to it. It's a very different kind of conversation. Now, doing that first step of the customer discovery where you really nail who your target customer is and what problem do they have is super important, but don't try to validate the solution at that step. That is, frankly, when I think about why entrepreneurs are more successful on average today than they were 15 years ago, I think it's a lot of it is that pivot away from getting ahead of ourselves on proving out the solution too early in the process. All right, I think we're at.
We have one question.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
People often estimate it will take X amount of time to complete a task. How much time do you think it will actually take them to complete it?
Yeah, so everybody's going to answer that question different. I'm pulling up but everybody's going to answer that question different. But what I'm telling you is teams will answer that question consistently incorrect. Right? So I've been on very high performing teams where like an hour of estimated work was more like 3 hours of actual work. But it was a very, very high performing team. They just were like crazy optimists. I've been on other teams where like an hour of estimated work was more like an hour and a half of work. They were also productive. Like, so the point, different teams, and you really, this is why you want your sprints to last the same amount of time. And you want to try to keep your Scrum teams relatively consistent, because then you're sort of eliminating this noise and you can kind of chunk that together. But the answer is different for every group, but it will be consistent across that group once you do this enough times. Okay, I think with that, we're 2 minutes over, so I will call it here, but this has been fun as always. Thanks for the time. Hopefully see you tomorrow at the forum.